So we know that both solid and hematological malignancies are strong and independent risk factors for thromboembolism. And annual incidence is 0.5% in cancer patients compared to 0.1% in general population. Up to 20% of patients with cancer experience VT in their lifetime. And if we consider the death rate, it is the second most prevalent cause of death in cancer, second only to the cancer progression. And among all VTE patients, cancer is the most prevalent cause of death. So we can understand the significance of VTE in cancer patients. Different cancers has different frequency of VTE. It is more prevalent in GI malignancies like pancreatic, lung, brain, hematological malignancies, and comparatively less frequent in head and neck cancers, breast, etc. And among the hospitalized cancer patients, the more frequent VT found in hematological cancers, lung, GI malignancies, brain, etc. The pathophysiology is same like virtuous triad. Endothelial injury by cancer-mediated cytokines, hypercoagulability, and stasis of venous blood flows. And cancer is a hypercoagulable state. And we know this extrinsic, intrinsic pathway of coagulation pathways. But in the body, what happens? The extrinsic pathway starts the coagulation. It is a tissue factor mediated extrinsic pathway. And when the thrombin is produced, it blocks the extrinsic pathway by tissue factor pathway inhibitor and propagate the coagulation pathway to the intrinsic pathway. In cancer, what happens? The cancer cells produce the tissue factors and it produces the heparinase, which blocks the tissue factor pathway inhibitor. It also produces cytokines, which stimulates and injures the endothelial cells and activates platelets, neutrophils, etc. So there is continuous propagation of the clotting on the activated endothelial cells by the extrinsic pathway, and there is a thrombus formation. By this Well score, we can predict which cancers has a propensity to develop this thromboembolism, and depending on the scores, we can diagnose the venous thromboembolism by duplex ultrasound and D-dimer. And once it is diagnosed, then we need to manage to prevent the thrombus propagation, to prevent pulmonary embolism, VT recurrence, post-thrombotic syndrome, etc. But by which we can treat them. These are the options: standard warfarin, then low molecular warfarin, and DOACs. So, and how do we choose the agent? We choose the agent by depending on the efficacy and safety of the anticoagulant, risk of bleeding, drug-drug interaction, patient preference, history of VT, GI absorption, and organ toxicities like renal impairment, so on and so forth. So, by different studies show that LMWH is the standard of cancer-mediated venous thromboembolism treatment. And these different landmark studies like CLOT trial, CATCH trial, CANTHATOX trial, they establish the role of LMWH over warfarin. And this meta-analysis also showed that as far as the major bleeding is concerned, as far as the VTE recurrence is concerned, LMWH has got advantage over VKA. And that's why LMWH is a standard of care for venous thromboembolism management in cancer patients. But now there is emerging role of these new direct orally acting anticoagulants. These ESMO guidelines in 2017 also doesn't put much importance to DOACs. And these different standard guidelines, they put LMWH as a first line of therapy for the management of VT. Now, what about these new options, that is new orally acting direct oral anticoagulants? The direct oral anticoagulants are basically directly acting to inhibit factor 2A thrombin like dabigatran, or they directly inhibit factor 10A like rivaroxaban, apixaban, and edoxaban. And they are got FDA approval for the management of VTA starting from 2010 till 2015 when edoxaban was approved. Now, this meta-analysis by ACCP, they showed the advantage of direct oral anticoagulants over the conventional method like warfarin or anti-vitamin K antagonist. Like as far as the VT recurrence is concerned, as far as the bleeding frequency is concerned, All these landmark trials, like Einstein trial, Amplify, Recovery 1 and 2, and Hokusai trial, they established the role of directly acting oral anticoagulants over warfarin. And we can see clearly that as far as the VT recurrence is concerned, the chances of bleeding is concerned, this NOACs has got an advantage over warfarin. And bleeding is much less in NOACs compared to warfarin. But when we compare it with the standard of care, that is low molecular weight heparin, these two landmark trials, that is SELECT-D trial, where rivaroxaban was compared with dalteparin, and this Hokusai VT cancer trial, where edoxaban was compared with dalteparin. It showed that as far as the recurrence of VT is concerned, these directly acting oral anticoagulants has got advantage even over LMWH. But as far as the major bleeding is concerned, that oral anticoagulant is more commonly associated with major bleeding. So, what is the criteria of drugs used in cancer patients? So, in those patients where there is less chances of major bleeding, which is not associated with GI malignancy, because GI malignancy is more commonly associated with bleeding, when the platelet count is at least more than 50,000, in these conditions, and where the end organ damage is less, that is renal dysfunction is not that severe, creatinine clearance is more than 30, and in these conditions, in the management of thromboembolism in cancer patients, the drugs can be used. And now all the standard international guidelines, be it NCCN 2019 or this International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis, ASCO, ITAC, all these recent guidelines put DWAC as a first line of therapy for the management of cancer-associated venous thromboembolism, along with LMWH. Here also, if there is no significant drug-drug interaction, if there is no chances of high risk of bleeding, then the DWAC can be used as a first line of therapy along with LMWH. In the ASH 2019 paper, there is the indications for DWACs. Patients without GI malignancy, low risk of bleeding manifestations, and if there is no strong drug-drug interactions. And the relative contraindications are if there is active GI malignancy, if there is history of GI bleeding, if there is a documented peptic ulcer, or the extremes of age, less than 50 or more than 150. If there is renal insufficiency, then there is a relative contraindications. In which cases we should avoid DWACs if there is poorly adherent, poor renal or significant hepatic dysfunction, pregnant patients on dual antiplatelet therapy, or poor GI absorption. In those cases, we can avoid DWACs. Bleeding is significant in DWACs, and how to monitor? Usually, PT and APTT is usually not prolonged, so we can't, or we should not, or we may not follow up them with the PT and APTT. But thrombin time is very sensitive to presence of DWACs, and that's why a modified thrombin time assay can be done for the lab monitoring, but it is rarely required, especially for dabigatran. And anti-10A activity can be measured to monitor the lab monitoring for the DWACs. But again, it is not frequently required because we may not regularly need to monitor these DWACs. Duration definitely depends on the presence of active disease. If there is an active malignancy, then we need to extend the therapy, and there is no schedule to stop. But if the disease is controlled, malignancy is controlled, or there is low risk of cancer, cancer like breast cancers, then we can think of stopping the DWACs. And if there is risk of hemorrhage, then better to avoid DWACs. As far as the recurrence of VT is concerned, in spite of continuing anticoagulant, there is 15% annualized recurrence of VT in cancer patients in spite of continuing anticoagulants. In case of recurrences, usually low molecular weight heparin has a preference over the DWACs. As far as thromboprophylaxis is concerned,
Dr. Raji, please conclude.
Yes?
Please conclude the talk.
Okay. So as far as the thromboprophylaxis is concerned, as far as Khorana score, if there is a high score, then better to give thromboprophylaxis with Epic 7, rivaroxaban, and Special scenarios are there. In transplant, we can use in platelet count. If platelet count is less than 50,000, then we may avoid this thing. And so this is the take-home message. That is, DWAX is among the first line of therapy. It should be used in cases of where there is chance of less bleeding. In GI malignancy, we should avoid. And if there is no renal dysfunction, then we can use DWAX. So DWAX is a new therapy for cancer-associated venous thromboembolism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raji, for the excellent talk. I would like to invite Dr. Rishabh Kothari, who is consultant medical oncologist at Narayana Multi-Speciality Hospital, Ahmedabad. He will be delivering a talk on opioid analogs in cancer pain.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
You're audible.
Is my screen shared?
Your screen is shared, sir.
Okay, thank you. So I will start off with the topic. My topic is opioid analogs in cancer pain, a balancing act. So the background is, as we know, most of our patients will require some or the other treatment for cancer. And as per available drugs, interventions, it is said that about 70 to 90% of the patients can be relieved of pain. And from our experience, we know opioids are the mainstay for pain management in cancer. So how to approach pain? So generally, we start with assessment of pain with visual analog scale and know the intensity. Then we know the character of pain, what is the pathophysiology, what is the cause, etc. And then we plan what is the disease modifying therapy, whether radiation or systemic chemotherapy or surgery will help for the pain and for the disease. And second would be symptomatic therapy. Most of the patients will require symptomatic therapy. This is the WHO ladder, which we have seen from UG days, that there are 3 steps. For mild pain, we generally start off with non-opioids, paracetamol, NSAIDs, plus minus adjuvant. For moderate pain, we use weak opioids, and for moderate to severe pain, we use stronger opioids. Now, there is a controversy that relevance of step 2 is questioned, especially for cancer pain, as there are data suggesting that low dose of strong opioids is as good as weak opioids. So, whether to give low dose morphine in place of tramadol or codeine. Just for the sake of, these are the options other than pharmacology which can be given for pain management. It could be intervention, it could be psychological, it could be neurostimulation, it could be acupuncture, massage, yoga. So we need to be conscious that these options are available. So now for pharmacological pain management, why we select opioids? Because it is the based on experience, it is safety, multiple routes of administration. We have oral, transdermal, IV, ease of titration, reliability of opioids. Most of the time you get results, effectiveness for all types of pain, whether it is somatic, visceral or neuropathic. Why there is a need to balance, especially for opioids? So on the one side, there is under-treatment of pain, as seen in about 1/3 of the patients. This is data based on Western data. I think it would be much more for Indian patients. Why is there under-treatment of pain? Either it is due to lack of sensitivity from physician's part, lack of skill, more focus on cancer-specific treatments, and fear of patient and relatives of drug abuse. And the other side is drug abuse, addiction, diversion of drugs to some illegal use, and lethal overdose. So, in my opinion, I feel that we are heavily under-treating pain as of now. And this drug abuse, addiction, and diversion, we still don't have that infrastructure and capacity to risk stratify the patient, or whether we don't have that knowledge how to see whether a patient of osteosarcoma, a young patient with mild pain who has history of drug abuse before, is likely to have more opioid dependency than some elderly patients of lung. So I will say what is the we should rather treat patients for pain without having that fear, which is called opiophobia of drug abuse or overdose. What is the main mechanism of action? It is the agonist action of mu receptor. The drugs could be either pure agonists, agonist, antagonist, or which is called as partial agonist, and pure antagonist. Generally, pure agonist and some partial agonists are used for pain management. There are some central acting analgesics with mixed mechanism, which acts on mu receptor also and some other mechanisms also. So I will just give you a list of the drugs. Most of the drugs are not available in India. So pure agonists, codeine, morphine, fentanyl, methadone are pure agonists. They are the mainstay of moderate to severe pain. There is no ceiling effect of analgesia. And methadone is to be used cautiously because it can have unpredictable dose variation, and prolongation of QTC is a thing of concern. The partial agonists most commonly used is buprenorphine, especially in transdermal form. The difference between agonist and partial agonist is that there is ceiling effect in partial agonists. These are the drugs with mixed mechanism, tramadol, tapentadol, which are commonly used by us. It is centrally acting analgesics that have agonist actions at mu receptor, and they also block uptake of monoamines. So, which opioids to choose when we want to start? Oral transdermal, there is no evidence to support superior efficacy or tolerability of any agent over another. So, patients, whether morphine is the best drug, it is not like that. It could be morphine for some and other drug for another person. Opioid naive and moderate to severe pain patients generally are started on short-acting mu agonists at low dose, and or mixed mechanism drugs like tramadol and tapentadol, or transdermal patch buprenorphine. Especially patches are used if patient is having dysphagia or poor GI absorption. Fentanyl transdermal patch should be preferred for patients who have complaints of constipation, because it is shown that the constipation is low compared to morphine. Which drug to choose, especially in some special populations like renal impairment, you prefer fentanyl over morphine. Chronic liver disease, you start with lower dose and you increase it slowly. Methadone requires help of specialists, because once we change from morphine to methadone, the equianalgesic dose is not quite uniform as with other opioids. So methadone transformation from methadone to morphine or morphine to methadone requires help of specialists, or it requires some experience. Codeine should be avoided for pain management. Once we have achieved round-the-clock analgesia, the titration between pain control and side effects has been achieved. There is no maximum dose. Like if pain has been controlled, and if pain is not controlled and there are no side effects, you can increase the dose irrespective of your maximum dose. So once we have achieved these two goals, then the aim is to come down on number of medicines to increase compliance and convenience of patients. So you shift from short-acting drugs to long-acting modified release formulations. What is the management of pain that is poorly responsive to opioids? So sometimes morphine won't work, but fentanyl will work. Sometimes both will not work, but buprenorphine will work. So opioid rotation is a good technique. And how to shift from one drug to another. So there are charts for equianalgesic doses which can be helpful, and adjuvant analgesics should not be forgotten, like gabapentin, pregabalin, antidepressants, and paracetamol, NSAIDs, all that. How should you manage a breakthrough pain? So most of the time it is managed by short-acting drugs like morphine immediate release, and there are some options of patient-controlled analgesia pumps which are IV or subcutaneous, where you give drugs, the basal dose is continued, and whenever patient feels the pain, he can have the rescue dose by himself. He can decide that. So this is for opioid analogs. Happy Independence Day in advance, and Jai Hind.
Thank thank you very much for that, lovely overview on the pain. I think there will be questions on this. I request everyone to post them here. Now, I'll just introduce my next speaker for today. I privileged to introduce Dr. Mansi Khanderia. She's a medical oncologist at Majumdar Shaw Cancer Center in Narayan Institute, Bangalore. And Mansi is going to be talking on endocrine therapy and menopausal syndrome in young females. I think a very relevant and important topic. So over to you, Dr. Mansi.
Good evening, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes. So I'll be talking about endocrine therapy and management of menopausal symptoms, mainly in breast cancer patients. So it's a more core medical oncology topic, but it is something which is very important and which we don't discuss very often. So Dr. Randeep thought that we should discuss it in today's seminar. These are the topics I would be covering. We know that the median age of diagnosis of breast cancer across the world is about 62. But in India, we do see far more younger patients. We do see a lot of them in 30s and 40s. Now,
Mansi, sorry to interrupt you. Could you just start your share screen? The PowerPoint presentation, slideshow.
Okay.
Ma'am, can you make it full screen?
Yes. Yes. Is it better? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah. The subtypes in young women are also quite different from the rest of the breast cancer patients. We do have far lesser luminal type A's, which fare better. But in younger patients, we have more of luminal type B. And we also have more TNBC and HER2 positive patients. The prognosis in younger patients in general across subtypes is much worse. The survival and the DFS are much worse across subtypes, as seen in several studies. So why is the prognosis worse in young women? So like I said, the distribution is much different, more TNBC, more HER2 positive, more luminal B. The clinico-pathological grade is also higher, the tumor size is higher, the nodal involvement is much more. Also, age under 35 years appears to be an independent adverse prognostic factor. High levels of Frankel and c-KIT are also seen in younger patients with breast cancer. And the most important, last but not the least, is poor compliance and adherence, especially in the curative setting. When the patient feels well, there is no visible disease and there is toxicity of the oral treatment, the hormonal treatment that's going on. So patients do tend to discontinue those treatments. Why is the non-adherence? So this is a bio-psychosocial model of adherence which has treatment factors, personal factors, and interaction with the system. All of these factors are at play, but the most important is the toxicity and the management of toxicity. Like I said, adherence is worse in younger patients and in older patients, but it's much worse in patients who are less than 40 years. And these patients tend to discontinue treatment, and obviously the ones who discontinue treatment fare much worse. Their survival is also worse. And why are young women less adherent? So there was this paper which was published in 2015 in US, which showed that there were obviously socioeconomic factors at play which could apply to India as well. Patients with radiation did not adhere. Most of them had fear of side effects or they had side effects. They also felt less informed about the endocrine therapy. They had negative emotions about endocrine therapy. And mainly because they are young patients, they have fertility concerns. And we do have a good trial now, positive trial, which does explore a lot of options for fertility preservation. However, I'm not going to cover that. That's a separate topic altogether. So coming back to the options that we have to treat our premenopausal hormone-positive patients, we have chemotherapy, tamoxifen, AIs, along with ovarian suppression. Based on the risk category, as per soft and text trials, the low risk get just tamoxifen. The high-risk patients get chemotherapy. After that, ovarian suppression with either tamoxifen or AI. And the intermediate risk do have to undergo the gene assay, and when not feasible, we end up giving them chemotherapy if the grade is higher. I don't need to re-emphasize why tamoxifen is so important. 5 years of tamoxifen continues to show huge benefit even beyond 15 years. The carryover effect is also seen. 30% reduction in mortality, 40% reduction in recurrence. When 5 years was extended to 10 years, also the benefit was much higher. And then addition of ovarian suppression also showed benefits, at least in patients who had higher risk features and who had received prior chemotherapy. So this is the basic algorithm that we follow, which I already mentioned earlier. Coming to the main topic, toxicity with AIs or tamoxifen are mainly because of estrogen deprivation, and all the systems which have estrogen receptors show these toxicities. So the reproductive system is the commonest: vaginal urothelial irritation, atrophy, incontinence. The musculoskeletal system also is affected. There are more arthralgias, osteopenia, osteoporosis, bone fractures. Cardiovascular system not so frequently involved in younger patients. And the CNS system, which is the main symptom, the hot flashes or hot flushes, whatever you call it, fatigue and cognitive dysfunction is seen in almost half number of patients. So the side effects of the two drugs, they are quite similar, though hot flushes, embolism, endometrial cancer slightly higher in tamoxifen, but the musculoskeletal symptoms, which are very, very difficult to treat, are much higher with aromatase inhibitors. So how big is this problem? So almost all patients have hot flashes or night sweats. 40 to 50% patients have vaginal dryness, dyspareunia. 40% have sleeping difficulties. 44% have depression. Fracture risk is higher, of course, more with letrozole and AIs than tamoxifen. And the other risk factors as seen in all the trials. Now, these toxicities lead to adherence rates of just about 80%. Only 80% patients, even in trials, continue hormone therapy. So in the real world scenario, it may be much, much lesser than that. All the toxicities increase much more when ovarian suppression was given in text and soft trials, and which led to stopping of OFS by 15% patients at 2 years and 22% patients by 3 years. Depression was seen in almost 50% patients. So the toxicity from OFS is higher than evident from the soft and text trial, and addition of AI seems worse in our patient's clinical experience. And the true impact of hormonal treatments in young women with active personal and professional lives may well be hidden between the lines of the clinical trial data. So a lot of us would not pay that much attention to hot flashes, but the patient is really distressed because of these symptoms. And we do need to provide them options so that we cannot just say that the elephant is out of the needle hole and just the tail is behind and you need to, just bear with it. That's the reason a lot of patients do not continue tamoxifen. So hot flashes, the most bothersome symptoms, are seen in almost all patients. And there are multiple ways to handle hot flashes. Of course, in a patient who did not have cancer, hormonal medication, estrogen supplementation or progesterone supplementation would be the ideal treatment, but we do not give it in breast cancer patients who are hormone positive. Non-hormonal medications, antidepressants, and gabapentin. I think most of us are more used to using gabapentin because we are, more comfortable prescribing it. But antidepressants also really have very good benefits. Almost 66% patients benefit with these. I'll go into the details further. Behavioral.
You will have to wind up just 30 seconds. Please come to your concluding slide.
Yes. Behavioral strategies and psychoeducation. In antidepressant, venlafaxine is the main drug which we should start using, especially in patients who are on tamoxifen. Gabapentin works in all. Alternative therapies work in all. Acupuncture has shown benefits in AI. Related pain, and there are local estrogen formulations which are available for the gynac side effects. Switching of AI from one group to from one drug to the other is also beneficial in some patients. And of course, lifestyle changes have to be re-emphasized again and again, especially loss of weight. Zoledronic acid can be added to tamoxifen and AI. Coming to the conclusion, the best hormonal therapy is the one that the patient takes. So we need to discuss and find out what would be the best. So even if you prescribe ovarian suppression and AI, but the patient does not end up taking it, the benefit is lost. We need better communication, better counseling, better reassurance and planning for fertility preservation, timely management of side effects, more awareness about use of venlafaxine, duloxetine, and gabapentin, involvement of a psycho-oncologist and maybe a psychiatrist, regular follow-up, and better compliance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mansi. I would now like to invite Dr. Vivek Agrawal. He is a consultant in medical oncology and hemato-oncology at Narayana, Havda. He would be moderating a session on cardio-oncology. Dr. Vivek, over to you.
We're really having a okay. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, Vivek, we can hear you.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying. That thank you for giving me this opportunity. My topic is managing cardiotoxicity in oncology. So cardio-oncology, it has become a big field, an upcoming field in the field of oncology. We have full-time fellowship programs in the West in cardio-oncology with cardiologists and oncologists making a career out of it. We have International Society of Cardio-Oncology, and they have a full journal dedicated to cardio-oncology and a full 3-day conference dedicated to cardio-oncology. There is so much to discuss. Good evening, everybody. I welcome my panelists, Dr. Vijay Kumar, Dr. Pradeep Mandal, Dr. Rohit Swami. They are all medical oncologists. Dr. Aparna Srivatsa is also a medical oncologist. Dr. Rashmi Dalvi is a pediatric hemato-oncologist from Mumbai. Dr. Hemant Madan and Dr. Anand Pandey, they are cardiologists. I hope all of them are there. So, cancer therapy induces cardiac injury, and these are the types of cardiac injury. This classification may not be a universally used one. Type 1, anthracycline, direct cardiac injury and cell necrosis. Irreversible. Type 2, this is through inhibition of ERB2, which is important for survival of cardiac cells. Reversible. Type 3, ischemia, coronary vasospasm, we see with capecitabine and 5-FU. Type 4, this is mainly thrombogenic in the large vessels due to alkylating agents and the TKIs. Type 5, again, radiation therapy, thrombogenic to the large vessels over a long time. And look at the number of toxicities. So there are a whole lot of toxicities ranging for arrhythmia, cardiomyopathy to vascular diseases, thromboembolism, pulmonary hypertension, systemic hypertension, pericardial disease and valvular heart disease. And all sorts of cancer treatments cause one or more of these side effects. So straight away, before going to the discussion, these are the two documents that probably I'll keep as a reference to all the recommendations that I've made here, and I forwarded all these to our panelists. Maybe Kashish can share these in the chat box too for everybody's reference. I'd also request Dr. Randeep to really remind me of time, probably once 20 minutes is left and once 10 minutes left, so that I have a track of time. So straight away coming to the discussion, a 66-year-old female, diabetic, hypertension, and DLBCL with stage 3AX. So Dr. Vijay, how will you do the pre-treatment cardiac evaluation? Just a one-line answer.
Baseline ECG, thorough clinical examination, and a 2D echo is what I would do.
Okay, 45-year-old male, tobacco chewer, no comorbidities, borderline resectable CA oral cavity, referred for neoadjuvant chemotherapy, quite a fit person. Dr. Pradeep, how will you do the pre-treatment cardiac evaluation?
So, sir, for this patient, I don't think that before starting treatment, only thing is that echocardiography we can do, because we have to give cisplatin. But he's a quite fit person. Even we can go without an echocardiography to start.
Okay, 50-year-old male, no comorbidities, metastatic renal cell cancer. Rohit, how will you do the cardiac evaluation?
Sir, I would like to do ECG, 2D echo, as well as to look for the hypertension, BP monitoring,
Okay.
and lipid profile also,
Lipid
and
profile. Electrolyte. Sugars, what do you think? No need.
Yeah,
Okay,
sugar
leave
also.
it. Yeah, Dr. Rashmi, 15-year-old male, PNET of the lower end of femur. Now we are going to start new adjuvant treatment. What cardiac evaluation?
So the clinical evaluation, of course, and I would do a baseline ECG and a 2D echo, and nothing else.
Okay, and a 70-year-old male, no comorbidities, multiple myeloma. We are going to treat Dr. Aparna.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so how will you do the pre-cardiac evaluation in this patient, 70-year-old male and no comorbidities at all? You want to do some cardiac evaluation or no need?
Yes, we will do a clinical examination followed by ECG and echo.
Okay, okay. So the whole point that I wanted to make here is that in all these patients, doing ECG, 2D echo is quite become almost a norm for all patients before going ahead with treatment. But we don't really need to only check for cardiovascular disease. We should also check for cardiovascular risk factors. We can, in future give rise to cardiovascular disease. So these are the risk factors apart from the cardiac disease or any other cardiotoxic treatment that the patient receives. We need to look at the risk factors also, like smoking, alcohol intake, obesity, sedentary habits, or presence age criteria, presence of hypertension, diabetes, or the lipid profile due to having hypercholesterolemia, or even the family history. So all these risk factors might also make the patient susceptible to cardiotoxicities, and in presence of these risk factors we actually need to consult cardiologists. What do you think, Dr. Vijay? When do you think we should seek a cardiology consultation before actually embarking on anti-cancer treatment?
Usually, if we find multiple comorbidities, especially an elderly patient with an LVE of, say, the borderline between 40 and 50%, and multiple comorbidities, dyslipidemia, when there are more risk factors with a borderline ejection fraction, that is when you would get consultation.
So, Dr. Aparna, we always see that a lot of oncologists writing, cardiology clearance before starting treatment. So, what do you think? Are we really seeking our cardiologist clearance, or we want to actually, sort of utilize his expertise in predicting the toxicities and optimizing cardiac care? So, what do you want actually from your cardiologist?
Sir, actually, for this chemotherapeutic targeted therapy, which are known to cause cardiotoxicity, we better take a cardiology consultation, and maybe we can go for something like a primary prevention of suppose there are risk factors, we can do something to alleviate or to be proactive and decrease the risk. Maybe that is how it helps asking a cardiologist.
Come on, excellent. So that is what we have come to, that we need to see the ECG, we need to look at the QT interval, that's also very important. Echocardiography with quantitative evaluation of ejection fraction, and look at all these risk factors, and if they are present, we need a cardiologist consultation. So cardiac biomarkers, these are very much upcoming in discussions, very much in use at many centers. So Dr. Rohit, what do you think? What is their use in oncology? How much do we utilize them? What is the use?
So if we are going to use any cardiotoxic drug, so I like to do these cardiac biomarkers before initiating treatment in those patients who are high risk of having further complications, like the patient who had previous coronary artery disease, or the patient who had suffered from the cardiac failure or have the low ejection fraction. And we like to monitor with the chemotherapy further.
Very, very good. Very wonderful. So these are the recommendations. So we should screen not only for the cardiovascular disease, but also the risk factors, especially if the cardiovascular toxicity or complication is associated with the treatment, and we need to initiate the risk reducing strategies, and as well as to monitor these patients closely. And we have to collaborate with our cardiologist early in the course of the treatment to optimize their cardiac care. And remember, there is evidence to show that cardiology consultation improves adherence to cardioprotective medication, and it improves survival. So cardiac biomarkers, again, the role is not very clear. We don't know regarding the timing and applicability. There is sometimes very subtle changes in these biomarkers. If there is infection or any inflammation, there may be rise. But yes, as Dr. Rohit said, they are more useful for high risk situations where there is pre-existing cardiovascular disease in patients who are receiving potentially cardiotoxic treatment. So Dr. Anand, you see, whenever we are measuring, we are measuring ejection fraction. So there are several, methods of measuring ejection fraction, and a lot of being is said about GLS. So why don't you explain our audience as what is this GLS, and how can we more objectify this left ventricular ejection fraction?
So, Dr. Vivek, I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes about cardiology and oncology. I think it's a huge specialty, and it is a separate specialty. So, first about GLS. GLS is nothing but a global strain pattern. Before you get overt LV dysfunction, which is very easy to see on echo, there is a longitudinal, global, and transverse strain patterns. There are prefixed parameters in all high-end echo machines. Before picking the absolute number of EF, they tell that strain pattern is abnormal. I think that is the time when we should act, and we can prevent a lot of cardiomyopathies.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that is one of the best part.
Yeah. So Dr. Anand, whenever you are reporting your TD echo in a patient of oncology, do you really always mention this GLS in your reports?
Well, truly not. See, if you pull all cancer therapy, it is like targeted therapies, you say, but they are targeting cancer, and off target they are cardiovascular disease. All patient, their cardiovascular involvement is there. So we have to have all cancer patients should be evaluated for cardiology. I think that is what is my dictum.
Yeah,
routinely we are not measuring strain pattern.
Moving to that. Yeah. So
we are not measuring strain pattern routinely.
Yeah.
EF we are measuring, yeah. And anything less than 50% we are allowed.
Okay.
Or fall more than 10%. Yeah.
Yeah. Doctor, if I may bring Dr. Hemant. So Dr. Hemant, what is the role of MUGA? When do you want to do MUGA? We oncologists, we have an impression that MUGA is more objective, and whenever you are not very sure, or the cardiologist is not very sure of left ventricular ejection fraction, you do MUGA. What is your opinion on MUGA?
Vivek, thanks. Thanks for having me over. Actually, with the current generation echo machines, we hardly refer patients for MUGA as a standalone specialty, as a standalone investigation. We have relied on MUGA a lot when we used to do stress thalliums very liberally, and MUGA comes as a stand-off of the left ventricular ejection fraction assessment when you send patients for stress thalliums. But nowadays, as a standalone investigation, we hardly rely on MUGA. The current generation echo machines are extremely reliable, extremely good. The current day parameters, like you said, the global strain assessment parameter. Can I just have a minute or two of comment?
I'm really sorry, but 30 seconds, Dr. Ahmed. We need to be very quick.
Okay, I will try and be as quick as possible. When I was doing my DM, I did my DM in Sri Chitra, and the institute next to that was a regional cancer center. And even at that time, this was about, maybe 19, 20 years back, even at that time, there was increasing data available that perhaps before left ventricular ejection fraction starts going down, diastolic dysfunction sets in much earlier. So in fact, my thesis was on anthracycline-induced diastolic dysfunction in patients with normal ejection fraction. So,
Dr. Hemant, just if I may interrupt you, diastolic dysfunction is something that we see in each and every echo report in our patients. Everybody will have grade 1 diastolic dysfunction or grade 2 diastolic dysfunction.
I wish somebody did an age correlation with that. If you have a young person who's on anthracyclines and he starts getting diastolic dysfunction, which was not there in the first echo report, somebody should really have a look at it. It's not diastolic dysfunction as measured only by one parameter. So you need some specified parameters to assess diastolic dysfunction. This I'm talking about 20 years ago. data now.
So that is what what we as oncologists have really understood, that there are technicalities into this 2D echo report, and we can't really take a 2D echo report on the face of it. And yes, the important point is there are parameters like GLS which really show a change much earlier than fall in ejection fraction, because once the ejection fraction has fall, probably an irreversible damage has already occurred and we need to act earlier. Now, one question
so out
that
of my 30 seconds, Vivek, you have taken away 15 seconds. So let me take my remaining 15 seconds. I'm sure
15 seconds only. Yes.
Yeah. This is regarding the biomarkers in assessment of cardiac toxicity. Well, the biomarkers that you described, they are essentially of two types. One is markers of myocardial injury, which is the troponins or the CPK-MB, and the other is biomarkers of left ventricular dysfunction. Now, to my mind, markers of myocardial injury are really not relevant as a screening evaluation. You could do them as follow-up evaluation to see whether myocardial injury is taking place, but certainly biomarkers of LV dysfunction in the form of pro-BNP is very important in telling you very early that LV dysfunction is setting in, so better be careful. They're highly sensitive. They are quantitative.
One question that I really want to ask, one of our oncologists like Dr. Pradeep, how much confident are you of your cardiologist actually knowing what to address in your patient, and actually knowing the cardiotoxicities of cancer treatment, something beyond anthracyclines? So what do you think? Are our cardiologists really aware of the toxicities of in oncology? What do you say?
So see that not only anthracycline, so I think is each and every oncology medicines
but
using.
How much sure are you that
So because that oncology medicines are nowadays evolving, and lots of tyrosine kinase inhibitors, MABs, and these are coming out, so it's not possible for the cardiology to get updated for all these cardiotoxicities.
Exactly. And so, Dr. Hemant, I may just bring you again for a very short answer. How much confident are you whenever you're seeing a patient of oncology, knowing that you are really knowing every toxicity, and you are really addressing the point?
Vivek, I won't speak for general for the entire cardiology fraternity as such, but I've had 4 different levels of interactions with oncology, so I'm very confident about myself, which is what I can say.
Okay. So the point probably here
is that Vivek may take chairperson's privilege to interrupt you here. I think this is a very important question to be addressed, both in the context of oncologists as well as in the context of cardiologists who are assessing these patients. I think
for a moment.
What is required, sir? 1 minute, I'll just finish. What is required is basically a format, which is an oncology echo format for initial assessment and for follow-up. Because the routine, they may be doing that, extended, I would say, workup, but unfortunately that doesn't get reflected on the reports, or if it's reflected, it gets lost somewhere in the reports. So I think what is required, and what I urge my cardiology colleagues, is that there should be a format, just an objective assessment, even if you don't know the drugs which are being used, the implication of those drugs. But I think a format which is a specifically oncology format, both for initial assessment and follow-up, is what is, I think, required, and I think we should urge for, and probably as a group in NH we should push for that to have, and that's going to be helping.
We really have the potential to sort of grow in the field of cardio-oncology, and the crux is that we actually need specialty cardio-oncology clinics and discussions and MDTs probably in order to advance. So Dr. Vijay will straight away come ahead to one of these cases. So this is a 66-year-old female, diabetic, hypertensive, stage 3 DLBCL planned for R-CHOP, and you do an echo, and it says 50% ejection fraction, a grade 2 diastolic dysfunction. So what do you think? You'll go ahead with treatment R-CHOP, or you don't want to give R-CHOP, or you want to change the treatment? What do you feel?
See, this particular disease is a curative malignancy. You wouldn't want to dose compromise, more importantly. So you wouldn't change the regimen. You would definitely put your oncologist on board. And more importantly, in such scenarios, the whole worry is of your adriamycin here. So you would want to keep a close watch on the 2D echo. Probably I would monitor once in 2 cycles.
Very good. Dr. Pradeep, same lady, but she has normal ejection fraction, but there is a history of coronary artery disease with myocardial infarction 2 years ago, and the PTCA was done 2 years ago. So again, same lady, R-CHOP. You will go ahead with R-CHOP, or you don't want to give R-CHOP?
Yes, sir, no issue. We can go ahead with R-CHOP, sir.
Very good, very good. So, Dr. Rashmi, if may I bring you again here. 16-year-old male and rheumatic heart disease with mitral regurgitation. He is well controlled, not symptomatic. 2D echo is showing ejection fraction 60%. Now, what do you say? We have to give him, that same patient PNET, we have to give him anthracyclines in the neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So, rheumatic heart disease, can we go ahead and give anthracyclines?
Right. So if you have a well-controlled patient whose ECG is normal and LV ejection fraction is 60%, I would perhaps give anthracyclines, but cautiously. So such a patient.
So what caution? What caution?
What caution? I would monitor the patient clinically, of course, but I would monitor with serial echoes also, because with subsequent cycles with a
serial echoes and biomarkers. Do you think this patient qualifies where we should do biomarkers? Now, not all patients who are receiving anthracyclines we need to do biomarkers, but yes, this is the point I want to make. These are those patients where we actually need to do the biomarkers, and we need to optimize. So we need to bring our cardiologists into board, and we need to give. But when the ejection fraction is less than 50%, probably these are those cases where we need to look for acceptable alternatives. Even in this scenario, if it is more than 40%, we can still give treatment with very cautiously, utilizing the biomarkers and the cardioprotective measures. But when the ejection fraction is less than 40%, probably we can't give anthracyclines, or we can't give trastuzumab. But other than these, these two drugs, probably we can still use all other drugs.
If I may add one thing, that in children, apart from rheumatic heart disease, we also look out for congenital heart disease, and sometimes we've been in trouble with patients with congenital heart who've been normal upfront, given anthracycline, and with subsequent cycles have gone into serious trouble.
Yeah. But still, any congenital heart disease, if they are very clinically controlled, the point is that they are not absolute contraindications if there is, no cardiac aging, but we need to be very, very cautious. So again, selecting our, anthracyclines, Dr. Rashmi, do you really think that there is a safer, anthracycline than, one is safer than the other? Or you think that at equivalent doses all are same? What do you feel?
They are, epirubicin, IDA, and dono are supposed to be safer, but
so very correct. There is no credible data to say that one is safer to other. There is no liposomal doxorubicin. Still we can say, but along these anthracycline probably we don't. Now cardioprotective measures. Yes, Dr. Anand, I will bring you in now. So really, when you are saying that we will use cardioprotective measures in these borderline cases, what do we actually mean?
Well, I think here there is a role of NT-proBNP as a serial marker 1, serial echocardiography 2. We can start ACE inhibitors and beta blockers. There have been some studies which have been shown to be preventive for preventing birth.
Okay, and exercise, what do you think? Does exercise help, or will exercise be detrimental?
Absolutely, I think physical conditioning is most important, and that is one part of rehabilitation. That is mandatory for all patients.
Okay, Dr. Rashmi, so we are giving anthracyclines, we have to give, but what are the ways, how can we reduce the cardiotoxicity of anthracyclines? Yeah, Dr. Rashmi? Dr. Rashmi, are you there?
Yes.
So how do we reduce the cardiotoxicity?
I can just speak from the pediatric point of view. So one is lifting the anthracycline dose. So we have a cutoff of 300, and we try to stay within that dose.
Yes,
then suggestion has been the use of continuous infusion. But
very good. Yes. So prolonging infusion time. Yes. Next point.
Then anthracycline analogs you already talked about. Liposomal cardioprotectant agents have been looked at with already has been mentioned by Dr. Hemant, and but there is no clear data in children on any of these. Now, dexazoxane also has been talked about, and there are studies in childhood ALL where it has shown much less cardiotoxicity with the use of this agent, but it is still not the standard of care.
So dexazoxane, I mean, any of my panelists, have you ever used this agent? I mean, we have always heard this right from our residencies, but have we ever used dexazoxane? Has anyone seen? I've never seen dexazoxane in my life. I don't know whether it's available.
So Vivek, it's not available in India, but it's we have used it in Sydney. We used to use it when the anthracycline dose used to cross 250, especially in bone tumors, Ewing's and osteos. So that was what was used.
Shown to decrease the left ventricular dysfunction by almost 3 to 4 times, but there are really concerns regarding myelosuppression, regarding decreased efficacy of anthracyclines, and availability is the big concern. But dexazoxane, it's a hard molecule. Again, trastuzumab therapy. Again, we have all these figures when to withhold treatment with trastuzumab. We all know the figures with lapatinib and pertuzumab. But again, Dr. Pradeep.
Vivek, 10 minutes is left.
Okay. Dr. Pradeep, 60-year-old female, and low ejection fraction, 40% ejection fraction with with some RWMA present. So can you really go ahead and give trastuzumab? What do you say?
Definitely, this is an adjuvant setting.
Yeah, curative setting.
Locally adjuvant. Locally adjuvant setting. So definitely, patient is HER2 positive, and heart disease is HER2 driven disease. So we can. I think I will give trastuzumab with very cautiously. I think in every cycle, so you can.
So there are recent studies which show that in mild left ventricular dysfunction, we still safely use trastuzumab. Now, because we are really running out of time, I'll really go ahead and discuss one of these cases. So, Dr. Vijay, this is the patient, 45-year-old male, no comorbidities, locally advanced, borderline resectable buccal mucosa. Everything was normal, and this patient was planned for TPF neoadjuvant chemotherapy. First cycle admitted, PICC inserted. Confirmed position, started with chemo, tolerated doses well, and when we started 5-FU infusion, 2 hours later, patient had a sudden cardiac death. So, what do you think? I mean, of this situation?
Yeah, the 5-FU induced coronary vasospasms is a major concern. In fact, we've had this. We did look at it in Amrita during my DM days, and we did report around 4% in patients who've received especially 5-FU infusion. So that is a major concern. So counseling is really important, and documentation is really important in such scenarios. And it's important to get a pre-evaluation, get your cardiac markers, baseline.
Pre-evaluation, Dr. Rohit, what do you think? Can you really predict this event?
So predicting it is very less likely, but still we can rule out previous cardiac diseases as well as electrolyte imbalance.
So these patients, they are so much more susceptible for having a fatal event. So we need to know which patients are more at risk. But how do we identify this event, and how do we manage it, Dr. Vijay?
Yeah, identification is it is actually pretty difficult, because despite your best efforts of monitoring these patients, there is every probability that you might land up with a coronary vasospasm and a sudden cardiac event.
Okay. And Dr. Aparna, what do you think? I mean, your patient has recovered, ejection fraction has recovered after 1 month. It was an acute event. Would you really dare to re-challenge with the 5-FU or capecitabine? Dr. Aparna, are you there?
Yes, sir. I think re-challenging is not prudent in such a life-threatening serious adverse event, and I would look for other chemotherapeutic agents rather than re-challenging.
Okay. How will you treat? I mean, how will you treat such a condition, Dr. Hemant? If I may bring you, acute coronary vasospasm with sudden drop in blood pressure and sudden, patient having a lot of sweating. How do you manage?
Well, the treatment is already there on your slide, Vivek. I think this is all the armamentarium that we have. NTG is predominantly a venodilator unless it's given intracoronary. So we can start with calcium channel blockers, and you need to give really high doses of calcium channel blockers, and of course stop the infusion and hope for the best.
Okay. So this similar case I had, Dr. Hemant, just I would like to your comment, 55-year-old male, hypertensive, and he was started on 5-FU infusion with float. He had a normal baseline evaluation. On day 2 of this 5-FU pump, this patient presented to my OPD with epigastric discomfort and anxiety. So I sent over to my cardiologist. I did an ECG. It was normal. The TROP-T card test was done. It was negative. The 2D echo was also done by the cardiologist, and he told me that it's normal and no intervention is required. So I just reassured the patient. I just gave him some antacids and I continued the 5-FU infusion and I sent him home. What do you think? I mean, I could have done something more, or what do you think?
It's very difficult to say, Vivek. Coronary vasospasm, de novo coronary. I'm not talking of 5-FU induced coronary vasospasm, but even de novo coronary vasospasm has been a disease which is very difficult to diagnose because it tends to be episodic, it tends to be variable. In fact, Prinzmetal's angina, which we used to swear as a coronary vasospastic disease, has been thrown out of the vocabulary of cardiologists. So, nobody really knows whether this exists, whether, such a, of course, 5-FU induced spastic angina definitely exists, but de novo spasm, it really
so very shockingly, you see, this patient I had sent home, and in the evening he presented to emergency with shock and he expired. I regret to this day, why didn't I stop the 5-FU infusion?
Can I just intervene here a bit? Prudence always suggests that to diagnose acute coronary syndrome, we need 2 ECGs and 2 biomarkers. That's what prudence always suggests, because biomarkers won't go up till the first 6 hours of an acute event.
So you really think I could have done BNP or something like that?
Yes, if the suspicion, I'm sure if it was epigastric pain and it was a right coronary kind of a lesion, which looked suspicion, an overnight detention or an overnight hospitalization with a ECG done 6 hours later and a troponin investigation done 6 hours later.
I lost him, and I still regret to the day why did I didn't do more. Why was I not more suspicious? But the message is 5-FU infusion. Any unusual symptoms, please do not take it lightly. Dr. Aparna.
And our victim is always epigastric discomfort is to be treated as precordial discomfort.
Last discussion, Dr. Aparna.
Yes.
Vivek, sorry to interrupt. You have to wind up in 2 minutes, 2 minutes maximum.
Yes, sir, 2 minutes. This is my last discussion. Sure. Discuss regarding the immune checkpoint inhibitor, related cardiovascular talk. So, Dr. Aparna, what do you think? I mean, any experience of ICI related CV talk? Because I haven't had a patient who had such an event, but there is data emerging and it's really concerning.
Yes, and every patient who reads about immunotherapy and comes is worried about this myocarditis, which is given a big hype in media and this literature. But I think I have not seen any case till now.
Yeah,
but we have to be cautious.
Have seen myocarditis. If you can share your experience. So I think none. So just I'll just wind up telling you regarding one of these cases. So this is one 67-year-old male who has a metastatic adenocarcinoma, EGFR exon 19 positive, first line osimertinib I started, and 3 months later this patient presented to emergency in acute shortness of breathing, and he was having bilateral pleural effusion, and what we actually found out was it was a transudative pleural effusion. His echo showed 35% ejection fraction, and he had high anti-pro-BNP. He had acute heart failure. There was his lung lesions had recovered, but he had heart failure. And I read up and I found that it is actually an osimertinib induced cardiotoxicity, a very rare thing that we found out. So again, one message that I wanted to give is that really the newer drugs, we really don't know what is the toxicity. So always look out for the toxicities. So with this, I would really want to thank all my panelists and thank everyone for patient listening. I think we were short of time. There was so much to discuss, but we could discuss this much only. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Vivek and the panel. It was a very interactive session. I think lots to discuss. We'll have probably another platform to continue. But I think we, as I said earlier, we should take this initiative to have some for the echo reporting. That's probably one of the takeaway messages from here, with the help of our cardiology colleagues. So with that, I hand over to Dr. Randeep for the next session. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, chairpersons, and thank you, Nidhi. And apologies to all the speakers where I had to interrupt, because as we come into the session, I always see that the last session is actually very important and shall not suffer. But seriously, all of you have done a great job. We come to the last session, and this is actually quite different from what we usually discuss in our meeting. This is more about geriatric assessment, psychosocial issues, abandonment. And to chair this session, we have Dr. Vinita Binoy. I would appreciate the efforts of Dr. Vinita, because she is in a different time zone. She is from Cayman Islands, and she could join. Thanks, Vinita, for joining as well as very actively participating. And the second co-chair is none other than Dr. Purna Kurkure, ma'am, my guide as well as one of my teachers. Ma'am, please start the session. Ma'am, please. Yes, ma'am. We can see you, and you have unmute yourself.
So come to the last session, and we have a very presentation now lined up. First is by Dr. Pragya on geriatric assessment. Because we all know that with the advancing age, and particularly in geriatric population, we can run into more toxicity. So geriatric assessment in the backdrop of this toxicity.
Ma'am, you have to unmute your mic. Ma'am,
unmute. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear you? Okay, so I invite Dr. Pragya Koka, who is a medical oncologist at Mazumdar Cancer Center, Bangalore, for first telling us about the geriatric assessment tools that are available, who can be used and combined with the various.
Some problem with the ma'am.
Yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm going to just start sharing the screen. Is it visible?
Not yet, ma'am.
Yeah, one second. Yeah. Is it okay now?
Ma'am, you'll have to make it full screen. Yeah, perfect.
Is good? Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to start. Okay, so first of all, I should thank Dr. Randeep for actually getting me to do this topic. I had very little awareness about this topic before he got me to start reading about it. And I found it very useful. And so what the topic is actually are practical tools for geriatric assessment in the clinic. So just I want to start with a small introduction. Age, as we know, is the most important risk factor for cancer. 60% of the cancers are diagnosed in patients more than 65 years. And unfortunately, elderly cancer patients are very underrepresented in clinical trials. So there is very limited existence of these evidence-based guidelines for treatment of these elderly patients. So what happens commonly when we treat older cancer patients is either we overtreat and cause toxicity, or we undertreat, leading to loss of efficacy and poorer outcomes. So the challenges we see in geriatric patients, now older patients are actually a heterogeneous population. They have various combinations of comorbidities, different physical reserves, different disabilities, and multiple geriatric syndromes. So one of the good approaches to approach this, one of the big ways we can approach this heterogeneity is through something we call a geriatric assessment. So this is what a geriatric assessment overview looks like. So it provides an overview of the general health status of the older individual. What we are looking for is actually to try and determine his functional and physiological age, which is more important than the chronological age. And it includes multiple various domains. It includes cognitive status, function status, comorbidity, nutrition status, mood, medication review, and environmental review, and even his social supports. So I'm going to start first with a simple case, something which we all commonly see in OPDs. So here's a 69-year-old gentleman who was admitted to a cancer unit in his local hospital because he had a locally advanced rectal cancer. So according to standard guidelines, the proposed treatment would be preoperative radiochemotherapy followed by surgery. So this man was admitted, he was treated inpatient, and 1 week into the treatment, he became non-cooperative, he became aggressive, he started pulling out his IV lines, and he refused to even get out of bed. The attending oncologist suspected some acute delirium, and so he called the geriatrician to get some advice. Now the geriatrician is surprised because this is an otherwise healthy 69-year-old male. Where did this acute delirium come from? So when he looked more closely into this premorbid functional status, what he found is that this man actually fulfilled a criteria for frailty. And he discussed with his daughter, discussion with the daughter actually revealed that he was actually dependent on basic living activities and even needed home nursing 4 times a day. He had fallen several times during the last month. He had over the years developed problems with his memory, and he was unable to pay his bills or even engage in social activities. So this is where we see that it is important for us to find out, do a geriatric assessment and find out what is the criteria that are being filled for frailty. So this geriatric assessment would have helped to make a better treatment decision in this case. The information of his premorbid functional and cognitive status is highly relevant in the context of a newly diagnosed rectal cancer. The risk of delirium is increased in patients with pre-treatment cognitive impairment. Risk of further functional decline is very high. The risk of chemotherapy toxicity is high when there is mobility reduction, falls, and there is need of assistance with medication. And the risk of complications after surgery is, of course, much higher in patients who are frail before surgery. So I hope I've impressed upon you the need to do a geriatric assessment in almost all of our patients, at least more than 70 years of age for sure. So what we are trying to identify is something we call frailty. So in daily geriatric oncology practice, frailty has been defined as an impairment in one or more domains of the geriatric assessment. So these are the different domains. Again, it's a repetition of a previous slide that I'd shown you. We are looking at functional status, comorbidity, cognition, nutrition, body composition, psychosocial, and social support. So these are the different measures which I'll be talking about in detail. So the tools that we have for geriatric assessment can be broadly divided into 2 tools. You either have a screening tool or you do a full comprehensive geriatric assessment. The screening tool will only take a few minutes. It can be used in a busy practice. And most importantly, we are trying to distinguish who's a fit older patient versus somebody who's at risk for geriatric deficiencies. So surprisingly, more than only 30% of our 70 plus cancer population is actually the fit older patient. And more than 70% of them are actually at risk for geriatric deficiencies. All the people in the latter group should undergo something we call a full comprehensive geriatric assessment. And this is a systematic evaluation, which is the most important geriatric domains. So there is a difference in the way these tools are used in Europe and in US. In the European countries, most of them start off by doing a screening tool, and only the full geriatric assessment is only done when there is a need to do it, or the screening test shows up a risk profile. Whereas in US, almost all centers do the complete geriatric questionnaire. Now, the advantage of the European tool is it's less time consuming, and you do it only in people who really need it. Whereas in the US model, the advantage is all the workload is mainly done by the patient, because the comprehensive geriatric assessment, almost everything is a patient-filled or a caregiver-filled questionnaire. So these are the screening tools. I've just mentioned it for the completion's sake. There are about 17 screening tools that are used, that have been reported to identify frail patients. what I want you to concentrate is only the one which I've highlighted, which is geriatric 8 or G8 as we call it. So the 3 screening tools that actually have been found to be useful in oncology are actually the G8, the triage risk screening tool, and the vulnerable elder 13 survey. So out of all these, the G8 is the only thing that you need to concentrate. So if anybody is sleeping, this is the best time to wake up because this is the only slide that is really of great importance for this particular talk. So there's a geriatric 8. This is or it's called G8. It has been specifically developed in oncology. It consists of essentially 8 items. 7 items are actually issued from a previous questionnaire, which is called the NMA questionnaire. I'll be coming to that again. And 1 item is relative to the age of the patient, whether he's less than 80, 80 to 85, or more than 85. The items that are selected from the MNA mainly concern the nutritional status. I'll show you the slide. The next slide shows what is a G8. Nutrition status, weight loss, body mass index, motor skills, psychosocial status, number of medications this person is using, and what is the self-perception of health. The score ranges from 17, which means that the patient is not impaired at all, to 0, which means he's heavily impaired. Any score lower than 14 requires a complete geriatric assessment, and this geriatric assessment has to be performed by a nurse or a clinical research associate. Generally takes less than 10 minutes, on an average about 4 minutes. So if you have 4 minutes to spare, this is what you should be doing. In fact, this is the, perhaps all of us should take a printout of this and do a screening geriatric assessment in all our 65 plus patients. So these are the questionnaires that we normally do, and these are the responses that need to be filled in, mainly with response to how has his food declined, how is his weight loss, mobility, neuropsychological problems, body mass index, whether he takes more than 3 prescription drugs per day in comparison to other people of the same age, how is this patient consider his or her health, what is the age? Age is the extra criteria that has been added. Score it from 0 to 17, anything less than 14, go for a full comprehensive geriatric assessment. So these are the other 2 screening tools. I'm skipping them, but these slides are available in the complete slide set, so maybe we can have a look at it later. So what we're going to talk about is the comprehensive geriatric assessment. So when the screening suggests potential frailties, performance of a comprehensive geriatric assessment is the optimal approach to better identify risks and consequently tailor treatment. And this has been demonstrated in numerous papers and even has been reviewed recently by the SIOG, which is the International Society for Geriatric Oncology Task Force. So the main domains that are assessed, again, a repetition of the previous slides, that is functional status, fatigue, comorbidities, cognition, mental health, nutrition, and other geriatric syndromes. So these are the different tools. Again, this is another important slide to look at. So the tools we have under comprehensive geriatric assessment are activities of daily living, instrumental activities of daily living, mini mental state examination. All of us are familiar with that from Hutchinson. Montreal Cognitive Assessment, Geriatric Depression Scale, mini nutritional assessment, which I'll be talking about, time to get up and go, cumulative illness rating score. So all these are available online, and I'll be talking about one of the, I'm skipping these mainly for the lack of time. So I'm going to be talking about mainly the mini nutritional assessment, which is on the basis of which the G8 has been developed. The mini nutritional assessment has been validated in 1994. This questionnaire has got 18 items, 6 of which belong to the screening part and 12 of it belong to the assessment part. There is a score from 24 to 30. It identifies who are patients with normal nutrition status. Anybody between 17 and 23, the person is identified as a risk for malnutrition, and anything below 17 indicates malnourished patients. It takes 10 to 15 minutes. It's a little longer than a screening test, and a relatively short one has also been developed and validated. So this is another a test that we can do, which is very simple, which is called time to get up and go, which we call TGUG. The Get Up and Go test was created in 1986. It evaluates basically gait and balance. The physician just asks the patient to get up from the armchair, walk a short distance, 3 meters, and come back. And the physician observes the patient's movement, and it assigns a score from normal to severely abnormal. A score of 3 and above indicates that this patient is at risk for falling. So, but it is a subjective test, and this has been replaced by another thing called timed Get Up and Go, which is validated in the N30. So I'm going to skip all these and go to the final slide, which is basically an assessment tree. And this is the take-home message of this particular talk. So if you have a patient more than 70 years, if the patient is looking healthy and in good condition, the only thing you need to do is do a screening test, like I mentioned, the G8, which has been validated extensively in oncology patients. If the screen is negative, the score is more than 14, You treat him as a healthy patient, give him the full dose of chemotherapy. If the screen is positive, anything less than 14, you do a comprehensive geriatric assessment. There are multiple tools available which cover different domains, and you determine whether this patient is vulnerable or not. If he's vulnerable, the treatment has to be tailored to the particular patient. If he's obviously frail and the comprehensive geriatric assessment actually shows that the patient has a high degree of frailty, we would consider best supportive care or maybe even tailor the treatment even further than a normal patient. So I hope that was helpful. Yeah. Any questions?
Pragnya, there is a comment from Dr. Sunil. Anything specific to Indian scenario in the context of geriatric assessment tool?
Specific to Indian scenario. So I think the G8 is the most validated tool, and I think that we can start by at least using a G8 in our clinics. And if the patient is showing an evidence of frailty, then probably we can move on to doing at least 5 more domains in the adjustment of life years, malnutrition survey, depression scale, time to get up and go. These are simple things that we can do and determine whether this patient actually can take. I think it is worthwhile doing it even in an Indian scenario. Of course, most of our elderly are frailer than the West, but I think it is worthwhile at least to do a screening tool in all our patients.
Yeah, in this context, if we can ask you, does the 70-year age gap for elderly really work in our context? Because as you rightly mentioned, Indian patients are frailer, not just in body, but also in mental health, especially when it comes to a life-threatening diagnosis. I think we should go to the age cutoff for assessing geriatric assessment.
Perhaps we should go lower, but we don't have any India-specific studies. So I would probably start my geriatric assessment plus 60 for most of our Indian patients.
Thank you, Dr. Pragnya, for that very good overview of the subject.
Yes,
am I audible?
The slide set is available in more detail, so perhaps that would be helpful also. Yeah.
Yes. And the message is to have a quick assessment of every patient who goes above 65.
Yes, at least above 65 for sure. And G8 printout in all OPDs.
And extremes of age are always vulnerable, whether it is pediatric or a geriatric. That is the message. Like, we have to handle them more carefully, and we have to be aware of the problems. Dr. Vinita, please introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now like to welcome Dr. Divakar Gautam to speak on the especially important topic, psychosocial issues in oncology. This is a very important but often overlooked aspect in cancer care, and this, ignoring this issue can lead to a lot of issues with continuity of care and complications. Dr. Divakar is a consultant in the Department of Psychiatry and Clinical Oncology, and he works at Narayana Multispeciality Clinic in Electronic City, Bangalore. Welcome, Divakar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vinita. Am I audible and the screen is visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Now, first of all, having this topic itself in this forum is a positive in itself. I must congratulate and thank the organizers for this. We all know that the cancer is single most disease condition which affects far more than any other medical conditions on one's not only medical but psychosocial. It proliferates into more than just their body. It proliferates into their families, sometimes even to generations it can go on. Now we are in a strange and unpleasant scenario where we are bombarded with a lot of stigmas, right? So we all know how much cancer itself is a stigma. The fact that many people don't even reveal, doctors don't reveal that they have a cancer. The patient doesn't want to tell their family members that they have a cancer. Family members doesn't want the doctors to reveal that they have a cancer. Their son or a daughter or a family member has a cancer, shows the stigma around the condition. And now adding to that, the stigma associated with anything which starts with PSY, there is a tremendous stigma. The combination of these two is deadly. And adding to all of this is now this new virus,
which is adding to all kinds of problems. So it only tells the complexities of the scenarios we are facing. Now, this is probably the most important slide of the day, and there's one more slide about how to set up services. As clinicians, as very good cancer care specialists, I mean, this is not just applicable for cancer care, but to every specialty, but more so for the cancer care. We all are very good at treating the diseases. I was just kind of hearing to all these talks, so beautiful. It's amazing clinicians, fantastic job by all of you. I'm sure you're doing a brilliant job to all of your patients. So we are very good at treating these diseases. So what is a disease? A disease is what a clinician picks up in the patient through his assessments, through the diagnosis, through investigations, etc. And his focus is mainly on the disease. What we invariably ignore is the illness component. Illness is what is the person experiencing. He's telling you the symptoms. From your side, you have got a vision of, okay, what does this symptom feel like? Where does that symptom fit in my schema of diagnosis? What investigation should I ask? What is the diagnosis? What is the best treatment for him? What is the best available evidence? It's all perfect. That's what, as a doctor, you're expected to do. But is illness or expression of the symptoms depends on various factors, including his own psychological status, his past, and the culture he comes from. The sickness is what the society thinks of this person. Okay, look, you've got cancer. Okay, what happened? Shall I come and help you? Is cancer contagious? So our behavior is manifested based on these many factors. One is the disease itself causing symptoms. The other is the illness, which is the perception of the disease by the individual. And the sickness, what does the society, immediate family, and the society perceive our condition as. Now, the psychosocial care is the single most important entity which connects all these three things. You can see in this Venn diagram, all agree in the center. So psychosocial care is a difference between treating the condition and treating the person with the condition. Now, this is the most important step. I mean, as a clinician, if we actually are open about these concepts, then we will start looking at what are those things which are affecting your patients. As cancer care clinicians, you all are very, very good at treating the acute issues. I mean, you all are very much swift in diagnosing, starting treatment. But it is during this acute stage where the risks of suicide are also much more. In fact, suicide, we are going to talk about it later. Suicide risk is at least 2 to 3 times more in this age group compared to any other kind of population. Delirium itself can cause a lot of behavioral problems. And as the disease progresses, especially for those conditions where the patient requires long-term chemotherapy, radiotherapy, palliative care, chronic issues will interfere and cause a lot of symptoms, and most of them are psychosomatic. Psychosocial issues, as mentioned before, we will be seeing the patient in our clinics with the family members. We don't know what is going on with them at home. I was pleasantly surprised that this term psychosocial care, mental health, is used at least 15 times in this symposium. That shows the openness of all the clinicians. So how to translate this to practice, that is the most important issue. Now, just briefly, often undetected and ignored conditions in all the cancer patients. About 50 to 75% of the cancer patients have psychiatric comorbidities. In my opinion, this is a gross underestimate. It is almost everybody. The most common condition is the adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder simply is a diagnosis of cancer because of the condition itself, stigma, preconceived wrong notion, societal perceptions itself evokes a lot of psychological distress in the patients. Depression is extremely common in cancer patients, so is anxiety. Somatization is very important. In India, we are the people who don't talk our mind as openly. We manifest depression through somatic complaints, through pain, through bodily symptoms, through GI symptoms. Now, in a cancer patient, one who is on a chemotherapy, how are you ever going to differentiate how much of it is because of the chemotherapy and how much of it is because of depression? If we are not picking up depression, what are you going to do? I've written there in the impact column, you are going to overtreat. You will think invariably that this is because of the chemotherapy that you're giving. This is because of radiotherapy. And that can have its own catastrophic events. Not only it increases the costs of the treatment, but it also can adversely impact the progress of the condition. Insomnia, delirium we touched upon, lot of these chemotherapy agents can cause at least brief psychotic symptoms. Again, we invariably think that it could be some form of encephalopathy. Immediately we order for one MRI scan. Imagine the kind of trauma which goes around with the patient and family around that. Not only it increases the cost, and of course self-harming behavior and suicidal behavior. A comprehensive suicide risk assessment in every patient at different stages is imperative. Like what Dr. Pragna just mentioned about importance of doing scales for the geriatric population. This is applicable for every patient irrespective of the age, especially the children and adolescent group. Substance abuse also as a coping mechanism. Somebody who's already taking alcohol or any other substances, they can abuse these medications. Surprisingly, abuse of the analgesics, particularly opioids, is not as much as we fear as clinicians are. Now, the causes, like I said, this can be situational, or it can be because of some of the treatment modalities itself, or it can be because of organic conditions, the cancer condition itself and progression. And if they have a pre-existing psychiatric condition, that also is one of the causes. Now, impact we touched upon. So non-compliance is one of the biggest kind of fallouts of the psychiatric condition or a psychological condition in your patients. If you're not even picking up that, you're not addressing that issue. So collusion is one thing that I have added there. Collusion simply means that we are not openly talking to the patient about their conditions because of various cultural factors. Now that leads to conspiracy of silence. Everybody is looking at faces, who is going to break the news and tell this patient. So invariably, there is a fear from the clinicians and the family members thinking, if I tell, then they will be upset. What is more upsetting than the condition itself? Every clinician should learn how to tell and what to tell, what is the environment that you will have to create so that they can hold on to this information. Now, the clinician burnout and moral injury of the oncologists and oncocare nurses is tremendous. Again, like how we don't detect or look for the psychiatric issues in the patients, we don't even look at our own selves. This is something which is a completely ignored area, especially if you see a lot of, there will be a lot of death. There's so much of morbidity. Sometimes you don't expect some things to happen. They expect. Now that Dr. Vivek was mentioning about one case, one death, and you can't forget that. Like that, especially for the trainees, it's so important that we look at this issue. Now, we are all very good at this as oncology teams. This is the big jigsaw. We all are very good at this, but the full treatment is never complete if you don't include the psychosocial interventions. Now, what is the barrier, and what are the things that we need to do to overcome this? First of all, yes, there is a tremendous lack of awareness and skills. Even in the onco, we all talk about it. There's so much of mention of psychosocial care. We still don't know what exactly it means. There is a lack of awareness about these things. As clinicians, you don't have time. You will see 50 patients, 60 patients lining up. How much time can you give to one patient? You have more kind of very important things to sort out at that time. Manpower issues, you don't have enough people to look after. Of course, there's stigma from the patients and the family. And unfortunately, anything to do with psychiatry, psychosocial interventions, it doesn't make a business sense. We are not going to generate any revenues. It is just stubborn people like us. We just stay in the hospitals here. Most of them do private practice or go abroad. So because it doesn't make a business sense, because there is stigma, we don't touch upon these aspects that much. But all of this can be changed with the attitude of the clinician. If you yourself open your eyes and look at all these facets of the human being, illness, sickness, not just the disease, then it is not difficult to make a business case. It is not difficult to make some time by having your own teams. Now, you have to invest in this. I was surprised or amused with this supportive care concept. What is a support? What is a care? It's contradicting in itself. It's as if there is a main hero and there is a support person or a side actor who comes. Psychosocial intervention is your fifth vital sign. Unless you take that or integrate into the main care, you are never going to complete the loop. Now you have to invest. You have to have somebody of a caliber of at least MPhil in psychology. They may or may not have any oncology training, but training can be given. There are some centers who are offering specialist psycho-oncology trainings now. Even in India, there are a lot of centers in Bangalore and also in Kerala. Those things can be explored. What they do a comprehensive psychosocial and spiritual needs and risk assessment, like what Dr. Pragna was talking about. All of them can be taken over by them. Remember, you don't have enough time.
Divakar, sorry to interrupt. Please,
I'm finishing. I'm
please
finishing.
the time
I'm finishing, sir. I'm finishing. Valiant group, I just want to touch upon. Take care of yourselves. You have to have a mechanism of absorbing your own emotional issues. You can't just sit on them. It's the doctors who don't talk about their own issues. Ultimately, they end up bursting one day. You have to have a mechanism to, deal with it on a daily basis. As cancer care clinicians, you are using all these things, but this is how it looks. But unless you add psychosocial care, which is a person-centric care, this is how a compassionate oncocare looks like. Not just providing a cushy seats or a smiling receptionist. You have to extend beyond that. Now, the chain is as strong as your weakest link. Remember, psychosocial care is not the weak link, but the attitude towards that is. Thank you so much. I appreciate that you have included this topic in your agenda.
Thank you, Divakar. Thank you so much for this excellent and passionate talk. I like that passion in you. You really care about this aspect of care and oncology, and I agree it completes our treatment. And I think just one question, I think Manasi has brought up a question about the role of support groups, which can be online, for various different cancers. So I think that's an important forum. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Any form of support is a good support when it comes to cancer care. Already we have so many things running, a survivors group, a lot of things. Now you need at least one person in your team, or at least one team. It's not just one psychologist. Psychologists should have some other counselors also. They shouldn't be just tick box. We have some centers where you have one person who will just tag along with the consultant. It's hodgepodge. It's not complete really. You have to invest in this. That person, that group can tag along with the other support groups. Again, needs and risk assessment. Unless you do a thorough needs and risk assessment, you cannot disseminate them to different groups. Support groups are welcome. They must be part of it. They alone cannot handle everything. So you have to have a specific team, especially for a group like NH, a hospital like NH. If we cannot have, forget about other institutes.
Completely. Thank you so much, Divakar. Let me now hand over back to Purna ma'am for introducing the speaker for our next session.
And before we start the next speaker, I would just give a last comment on this psychosocial support and the lack of manpower in the country. There are very, very few psycho-oncologists that you can really find and who can contribute very positively. And the support groups also are not just face value just to get together, but working at the very grassroots level as to how to support this, whatever group you select, a survivor or in a palliative situation or a disease-wise. It's a very, very specialized field which we need to concentrate on, and I'm sure we will take it up because this has been my passion for a long time, and we will take it on as to how to integrate psychosocial care in giving the active oncology care. So now we come to the last lecture of this session and for the webinar by none other than Dr. Sharad Damodar, who is also co-chairperson or a vice chairman of our oncology collegium and head of the medical oncology, hemato-oncology and BMT program at Mazumdar Cancer Center. And he's going to tell us about something very new in the field of oncology care as to how a cancer care navigator can impact outcome in the oncology care. Dr. Damodar, please.
Thank you, ma'am. I think we're coming to the end of this excellent webinar, and it's nice to end with dessert. And so I'm going to do a short, sweet talk quickly to just wrap up, what has been kind of discussed through and through with various talks. I think Divakar also mentioned a lot of the psychosocial issues which have been brought up. Now, end of the day, all physicians are doing a great job of treating the patient. But then if you look at it from a patient's perspective, there are other things just, more than just treatment, which they have to navigate with, and thereby they need help in that area. So I think this is an interesting concept which has come up. It's been there for some time. When I actually went and dug out and did some reading, it's been there for quite a few years. but it's something newly introduced to our country, and I think Tata Medical Center in Mumbai has taken this up and is actually providing a training course in this, which is really nice to know. And clearly they've realized the importance of this. Now, by definition, what would you really call, Cancer Care Navigator? This is an individual trained to help identify and resolve real and perceived barriers to care, enabling patients to adhere to care recommendations and thus improve their cancer outcomes. So, end of the day, they are actually helping the physician in improving outcomes. And first of all, is there a need for such a role? Clearly, evidence suggests that there is. So you have to go beyond the treating physician to look at other factors which also impact cancer care. Now, who could they be? Now, cancer care navigators or cancer patient navigators may be professionals like nurses and social workers who've actually taken this up, on a war footing in some of the bigger cancer centers in various parts of the world. They could be paraprofessionals like just the community level health workers who take it on themselves that they will focus on cancer patients. It could also be community leaders and then peers, including cancer survivors. So we've seen that happening sometimes even in our own setup, where somebody who's once been treated and comes out of a cancer feels this need to give back because they've gone through so many issues and they think that it makes sense to help other people so that they don't have to suffer that much. And it can be in two ways. It could be totally a clinical setting, like a major hospital setting. It could be a community-based setting. So there are two settings which we look at. Is there a need? So if you just look at data, I didn't put all of that, but clearly this kind of patient navigator is clearly appreciated by patients. So there's good data to suggest that patients are very happy when they have this assistance, and that navigated patients are more likely than the non-navigated ones to come for timely screening, follow-up with diagnostics, better follow-up and better outcomes. So this evidence is clearly out there. And thereby people have realized that there's a need to look at this because this is definitely going to improve your patient outcomes. Now, I'm just digging a little into the history of this. This was first actually brought up by Dr. Harold Freeman way back in 1990 when he looked at the US healthcare system and they looked at a small, low socioeconomic black population and looked at the breast cancer outcomes in that subset of patient. So he began to analyze this and realized that there are a lot of other factors which are influencing treatment outcomes. So there was poverty, low socioeconomic status, social injustice, their cultures, mindset, some beliefs. And as a result of this in this particular Harlem study, they noticed that the screening, the pickup rates were less dismal, less than 10%, and the treatment outcomes were somewhere in the 30-35% curative intent range for a very curable disease like breast cancer, early breast cancer. And then he made this intervention and picked out some people and then said, let's make a group where we let people educate these people, tell them what is the actual reality. And that was the concept of how this business of a cancer care navigator came up. And then down the line, when they reanalyzed after about 1 to 2 years, suddenly the whole thing changed. The screening outcomes improved, tripled, and the curative rates doubled. So clearly there was a role for this to be put into practice. And he basically divided this was the outcome of that Harlem model, and that's when they started defining that when you look at the treatment of cancer care, there is a cancer care continuum. It's divided into 6 phases. I will come to that a little later again. Prevention is the first component, then there's early detection, diagnosis, treatment, post-treatment, quality of life, and then survival, survivorship, and sometimes even a little bit of palliative care comes a little ahead in that arm. So these are the 6 kind of boxes we need to look at. And you'll realize that physicians are primarily focused in the middle segment there. So proper diagnosis, treatment is the chunk of what we do. Little bit into prevention, early detection, little bit of post-treatment follow-up, survival, quality of life. So these are things which are kind of lower down in the priority because physicians are overwhelmed with the work which you need to do. So this is the same cartoon which is depicted here, and when we looked at the 6 subsets, and various priorities have been listed out, but end of the day, they all need to come together as a continuum when you look at a patient, because that's exactly what his objective is. At the end, it may be survivorship, it may also be somebody who's not doing well and you need to look at end-of-life care, the role of palliative care. All this needs to be factored in. So somebody has to do that talking and dissipate this knowledge. That's where this cancer giver comes. So now this kind of program, once they analyzed how they would kind of put it into practice, they first came out with the 5 A's, which is being available, accessible, affordable, appropriate, and accountable. Then they added the U to it and called it understandable. I will quickly run through each of these components quickly in the next few slides. That these were then, the 6 parameters here were then linked with the 6, cancer continuum outcomes. And then they made a little table and said, this is the way you prioritize and look at it. So you've got the same 6 which I mentioned initially: education, screening, diagnosis, treatment, survivorship, and end of life as the 6 phases, and then each of these. So the first component is understanding disease. So we have a lot of taboo, a lot of beliefs, a lot of misinformation which somebody has to convey, and the physician obviously doesn't have the time to do that. Neither will the nurse do it, because she's too busy trying to give the medication which has been prescribed by the physician. So somebody has to sit down and give time and make the person understand what this means. So like Dr. Divakar mentioned, a lot of people don't even mention the word cancer. So a lot of patients don't even know. So if you're at that level, then what understanding will the patient have about his disease treatment? And obviously he's going to say that nothing's working for me because he doesn't even know what he's getting treated for. So these are some issues which also have to be put into the perspective of the background you come from, your socioeconomic background, your education background. So understanding that component is essential, and thereby you need somebody to provide that. The second part is, what are the resources which are available for somebody's treatment? So are there, services? Is there some handouts? Is there some literature? What are the low-cost services which a patient is eligible for? Does he get some insurance cover? Is he eligible for some scheme? Is he eligible for some free drug, some trial drug, something which will help his financial status? And in our country, I think that's very, very relevant, because the economics of treating a patient with cancer is huge. And you yourself would have seen a lot of patients don't have insurance. You're trying to, we do this on an everyday basis, try and fit somebody into some scheme and push him through so that he gets some treatment. So that's an important component to know what all is available. The third is, it's available, but is it accessible? So somebody has to be guiding that person, saying that, these are your modalities of treatment which you can access. These are some of the help which you can access to, some government schemes, chief minister schemes, some social media funding. All this somebody has to assist, because it's not going to come bang on to the patient who's already in depression from the disease, or he may not even know what's happening to him. So this is where we need a significant intervention, so that whatever is there out there is actually accessible to that patient. Affordability, like I've already brought this up. So clearly a lot of stuff which may be the standard of care may not be affordable. Then how do you then factor in and bring treatment to this patient? You may have to work around a few of these little obstructions which you have towards standard of care, and see how you can factor in. There may be comorbidities which you need to factor in. There may be other social support issues. You cannot give somebody high dose chemotherapy and send them back to a village where there's only one room and people are living, all of them are living in just one room. Chance of infection are going to just take off. So all these are things which you need to factor in when you're looking at treatment and its costs. And what are the help which you can provide from various agencies, which can be governmental, non-governmental NGOs and that kind of stuff. So there is an area where a lot of guidance is required. The fifth component is, how appropriate is this treatment? Now, are you standing on your head and trying to do something great when somebody really doesn't care or doesn't believe in that? There are a lot of misconceptions, beliefs, which have to be broken down as a barrier to patient understanding. And there are some cultural differences. Are there issues where people think differently? Some people just say, we really don't want, we just want straight away go into palliative mode. So in that background, are you then trying to go and push some horrendous chemotherapy and make him more miserable than what he is? So there is a need to look at the appropriateness of therapy. And at the end of all of this, when somebody is doing all of this, we need to be accountable for the care we give, which also comes for the Cancer Care Navigator. He needs to make sure that all of this is understood, it's documented. At the end of the day, if you want to do an audit of all of this, you need to know what it has actually done to patient care and how much of improvement it has provided. So that's how these 6 factors have been brought into play. Now I'll come to the part which is actually happening here in India. So the Tata Memorial Center in Mumbai has actually come up with this program, which is a patient navigation program, which is a 1-year program for people, to enroll for this. It's called Kevat. It's named after the person who was a boatman who ferried Ram and Sita across the Ganges in the Ramayana. So that's how this name was coined. And this is typically the navigator in its true sense. He's going to be the fellow guiding you to cross the river. Now, what was the thought process in coming out with this? So you can see the cancer burden in India is obviously going to jump from 2012 to about 2035. There's a huge jump. If you look at it beyond 2040, we're going to have a doubling of the number of cases. This increased burden obviously is going to stress the tertiary care centers and the cancer centers. because everybody is going to be focused on early diagnosis and treatment. You may not be actually having the time to look at all the other components which are as important, and thereby the need for people to look at that part of treatment. And they put down these, definition of what they envisaged as a patient navigation program. So create a trained task force to facilitate patients' journey from entry to the hospital to follow up and getting back to normal holistic needs of the patient. So there are all components which are taken care. This is the definition of the program. I won't really read out all of this for want of time, but the gist of it is you need to get the patient to understand what his disease is, what is the best modality of treatment, what are the resources he has for that, and how is he going to come out successful from this outcome. Now, let me put this perspective for the Oncology Collegium. Now, clearly, I think...
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that's my last slide. I should be finishing.
Yes. Okay. Please conclude, sir.
Yeah. So, for us, I think the need certainly exists. We need to look at it. How we will organize this is either nurse, community, or patient caregiver is the potential sources we can tap. And I think this is important, especially, when you see a huge building like this and you're this little fellow as a patient trying to crawl up the ramp and you're wondering what on earth is going to come and hit me. So I think MSH is a good place to start this, and certainly we are prepared to get this going. Thank you. I'll end here.
Thank you, Dr. Sharath, for that concluding lecture, which is very, very important. And that's how we have kept it as a concluding remark, because this is the way forward in making our oncology care a complete care. That is very, very important. So with this, we come to the end of the webinar. And I thank all the participants who have stayed on. I can see the number which has little dwindled, but still very respectful. And I thank Dr. Randeep for all the troubles that he has taken. And over to you, Dr. Randeep, for concluding remarks and closure.
Thank you, ma'am. It would not have been possible without the support of the whole collegium, and of course it has been all the colleagues of NH Cancer Care and the delegates. A special thank to Kurkure ma'am, Dr. Sharath and Dr. Sunil for all the support and guidance. It is my duty also to thank Kavina Creation and Kashish for being very handy and organizing as an event manager. And we have to also thank our sponsors, Lupin and Glenmark, for the grant to conduct it on the platform. So with this, I think we are also, all of us are proud of our independence and the heroes which have given us. A very happy Independence Day to all of you. And we know that COVID is having its different roop and avatars in different states. So we all, pray to God that all of us stay safe and keep on meeting virtually, at least for this year. Thank you and good night.
And a last remark, that this is not the first and the last webinar. And we request all our Oncology Collegium colleagues to think about the next topic and keep going and keep doing this activity through the year. Thank you.